Welcome to what is going to promise to be a great panel discussion on audience data, artificial intelligence, personalisation and engagement. We've got some expert panel of experts, an excellent panel of experts here working at the forefront of digital journalism. They're going to introduce themselves in a second, but we have Philippa Jenkins from The Independent, we have Evan Kypreos from Platia Digital, and we have Alex Plim from Time Out, just as they're checking in there to make sure that they are who they say they are.
Sorry, guys.
Yeah, don't worry about it. But before they introduce themselves, let's just talk a little bit about Taboola. If you haven't heard of Taboola, we power recommendations across the open web. We work with publishers around the world, including Reach, the BBC, Le Figaro, El Mundo, and obviously The Independent and Time Out as well. And we help them build audiences, keep users engaged on their site, and monetize their content. Now, monetizing their content is what we're largely famous for, but we also provide a number of editorial products that help publishers increase their audience and increase their engagement. And the flagship product we have is called Newsroom. And Newsroom is an audience analytics platform that is used by thousands of journalists every day across a number of publishers, about 350 publishers worldwide. And it provides real-time audience analytics, sophisticated engagement metrics, including subscription metrics, trending topics across the open web, and we use artificial intelligence and natural language understanding to gather those topics, and A/B testing tools to improve homepage click-through rate. And the homepage is something that we've been really focusing on lately, and we've developed a new product we call it Homepage for You, which is all about personalization. So we enable editors to personalize areas of their homepage using advanced AI and signals such as browsing history, the context of the article, the type of content that it is, what other people are using and what other people are reading as well. And we've had some really interesting results. We work with The Independent and a number of other publishers, and we've seen some results in terms of increasing CTR, reducing bounce rate, increasing pages per session by personalizing areas of that homepage, showcasing more content, more relevant and interesting content to the right users at the right time. But obviously AI and journalism is more about personalization. We've heard a lot about it in the last couple of days here in terms of generating content, in terms of analyzing huge data sets, and improving workflows and so on. And of course, ChatGPT has sparked a whole new debate on what lies ahead. So let's have a look at that debate, and let's join that debate and see what our expert panels think of AI and big data. First of all, I'd like to introduce our panel. If you could introduce yourself one by one, say who you are and what you do, and then we'll crack ahead with the first question. Philippa.
Great. I'm Philippa Jenkins, as Nigel mentioned. I'm the strategy projects editor at The Independent. Largely what that means is a lot of the operation side of the editorial side of the business comes into me, and most importantly in terms of how that relates to today, a lot of our work across audience is something that I'm across day to day, both for our main site but our other two brands as well, Indie 100 and our Espanol website as well. So have got a large overview of how all of that plays in terms of what we'll be talking about today, both in terms of data, audience and AI.
Hi, I'm Evan Kypreos. I am the founder and director of Platia Digital, SEO and editorial consultancy. Before that, I was audience development director at Future Publishing and at Time Inc. And yeah, really one of the things I do is look at how clients can use data to grow their audience and also make more money out of their audience.
Hi, I'm Alex Plim. I'm the Senior Director of Digital Content Strategy and Innovation at Time Out. So in my role, I manage the UK editorial team, which includes Time Out London, which is our kind of best-known brand, but also all of our travel output, all of our entertainment and movies output, and also our kind of national coverage of the UK. So I spend a lot of time with editors, working on the day-to-day as well as what we're doing within a month or a quarter or a year, and certainly using data to inform our strategy, but also finding ways to make data accessible for editors so that they can use it in their day-to-day. I spend quite a lot of time on that.
Excellent, thank you. So the first question is around exploring data and how you use that to inform your content strategy. Maybe Philippa, you'd like to start with that in terms of how you use audience in your own newsroom and how you get your journalists engaged and using that audience data.
Yeah, so purposefully what we do is be very led by audience, and as a result our newsroom is an audience first newsroom. And what I mean by that is that we are leading each day with what we know and what we are predicting is going to drive traffic via our audience team. And so quite unusually, when you put it against lots of other models across other newsrooms, what that means is that our audience team are then guiding what the rest of our across the newsroom are then going to be working on that day in terms of what the major news themes are, and what that then looks like both on the day but in the longer term. So that is vital from the point of view of how data is working within that, because without that data from the likes of Taboola's newsroom product, we would be blind, or certainly a lot more blind than we are. And so we lean into what all of that data is showing us to then try and determine what the priority should be to actually then present content and have the focus on things that are actually what people are interested in on that particular day, and over a period of a month, actually what we want to lean into the most and put the resource into particular areas that we know people are going to want to read the most about and watch the most about at any one time. And I think that the more that we do that, the better results we see. And it's really interesting when we do deep dives after any significant news event. Generally what plays out is that where we've been more guided by data from start to finish, the results tend to be more successful, because we are actually providing something in terms of the content that people want to read, rather than trying to determine it on our own judgment, which of course for obvious reasons can be highly subjective, and therefore it's not actually presenting content that is necessarily as relevant as it could be, but also galvanizing the general interest that the data is then telling us instead.
And how does that affect the journalists as well, in terms of when they see, after the event and they see the success of something that they've produced? Is that like build momentum in terms of adopting more data-informed strategy?
Yeah, I think the key thing with it that I've always seen is that it can provide real-time satisfaction as much as anything else, and therefore you very quickly get that buy-in where you might not otherwise, because the results are right in front of anyone who is providing that content. Those journalists, those writers, those who are working on that content at any one time, if they are using any tool like Newsroom as an example, if they are starting to see what they're producing marry up with where the interest is, actually that's hugely satisfying. It's so far removed from print days where you might have to wait days or even weeks to actually see what kind of interest there was in what you were writing about for, what might have been on the front of a newspaper at that time. The fact that you've got real-time data to be able to see that means that, as you're asking, Nigel, the buy-in and the satisfaction is there, so that the actual uptake and what the journalists want to be shown is all tied into one.
If I could just jump to Alex as well, because you talked about real-time, Philippa. Alex, your content is arguably more evergreen. How do you use data in your strategy? How does that compare?
So there's definitely a lot of parallels with what Philippa was talking about. We kind of, a lot of our output sits across two different kind of time periods. One is more evergreen. We plan for that. We ingest data that will enable us to pick the right pieces of content, and then obviously we track it and react to that over a longer period of time. But we do also do a lot of newsy stuff, which is kind of echoes a lot of what Philippa was saying, where the real-time analytics is crucial for that. We're similar in that we try not to create a single piece of content without knowing exactly where we expect to get the audience from and exactly where we expect the content to be distributed. I tend to find that we use data, whether it's for the more evergreen stuff or for the newsy stuff, in a very proactive and reactive way. So we're using data to try and pick the right story, so we're being proactive with what we're picking, but then real-time analytics enables us to be a lot more reactive. So if we see something taking off in the last 10 minutes, we can do something with that, we can build on it, we can iterate on that. Similarly, just as importantly, we look at what doesn't perform as well. So every day, every hour, we're looking at what we've pushed out that hasn't stuck, that hasn't connected with an audience. And I think that's just as important as looking at what does work. But just to add to the question about motivating editors and kind of getting that satisfaction, that's something we work quite a lot on at Time Out. And it's very easy to get a lot of instant gratification from page views, from a kind of a raw scale metric. But one of the things we're trying to get better and better at is appreciating engagement a lot more, which might be dwell time, it might be page views per visit, lower bounce rate, some of those slightly more difficult to wrap your head around metrics. I'm trying to find ways to bring them to the forefront so that an editor who is perhaps writing about something a bit heavier, like it might be an art review or a think piece on movies, that might not get the same scale, but it gets a lot more engagement. So I think we use tools like Taboola Newsroom to kind of analyze exactly what the value of a page is, and it's not always the obvious one.
Thank you. And what about you, Evan? You've got a lot of experience with, particular in the technology field. What do you see as the kind of key metrics that you've used with your editorial teams?
Yeah, I mean, they've covered some brilliant points here. I just want to say particularly the one about looking at the things that haven't performed brilliantly well. I think that's a really useful way of kind of going, okay, well, if I stop doing that, then I can do more of something else that is delivering. So that's really useful. I think I've worked on a lot of specialist publishers and a lot of specialist titles, like tech ones. I think the main thing that I like with things like Newsroom is finding out what's happening in the bigger world, what's happening in the wider world, and then using that to kind of inform content that's for your specialization. So you're kind of going there, kind of going, okay, what angle can I take as a tech publisher, as a homes publisher, as a sports publisher, to kind of piggyback on that interest and kind of get more of that. So I think that's a key thing as well.
There's actually, just to jump in on one extra point, you're right. Obviously, we're talking about how important it is to look at what doesn't perform so well as what does. But bringing that back to your point, Nigel, about motivating editors, it's a slightly tricky world to navigate around. If you're spending a little bit of time every day saying this didn't connect, it can be very demoralizing. And that's always an interesting one for us. Is how do you get editors to have the right mindset towards engaging with kind of negative data, if we can call it that? And yeah, there are no easy solutions, but I think it's an interesting world.
I think another thing where real time is really useful is if you can see if something's working right now. So if something isn't working, you can do something about it. Can you add more context to it? Can you change the headline? Can you do some other things? Do you want to write more about it? So I think that's where the data is really useful as well. So you can kind of go, okay, well, it's not working right now, but is it because the execution hasn't been great? So can I do something else?
I think also just to come in on the negatives as well, I think it has to be accepted that, of course, the other side to all of this is that the buy-in isn't always there. You can't always have that really positive conversation with anyone within the newsroom who actually then might come back and say, well, I don't want to write about that, or I don't really understand why we're covering this, or equally, why are you ignoring this? I think this is really important. And sometimes it does lead to difficult conversations. You know, you have to be quite upfront about it and work it through in terms of trying to rely on what the data shows and obviously equate that to, on the other side of it, human beings. You know, it has to be accepted that it is the humans that are generating that data in the first place, because that's what they're reading and that's what they're watching and that's what they're coming to that particular publisher, the likes of us, in that instance for. So I think, as you're saying, combining all of that doesn't necessarily mean that it's a quick win. It's not an easy win all the time, but I think it can lead to longer term views that are then really well embedded, because if you've taken the time to invest in those conversations that aren't always easy, like I say, actually it makes people much more aware of the wider picture that I think otherwise they can become very blinkered in terms of what they should and what they shouldn't be covering.
Have you got any specific examples of when you really reacted quickly to maybe real-time data, like a huge news event or something that was unexpected, and you used data to kind of jump on that and to improve the content that you created?
Sure, I can come in on this. So, interestingly, Nigel and I earlier were talking about two examples, one more recent one a little bit longer ago. One of which, the longer ago example, is the Oscars last year, which, as I'm sure you'll remember, had the infamous slap by Will Smith. And then the more recent one is the Super Bowl show with Rihanna obviously announcing her second pregnancy. What's really interesting is how successful both of those were for us in terms of the audience that we could harness. It was an incredible success. We had hundreds of thousands of people coming to us to read and watch the content on the site about that. There were two events that were massively high interest for obvious reasons in both examples. But I think two aspects to it is that, one, because of the fact we were able to look at the data ahead of time on both of those events, although we couldn't have predicted either of those things happening specifically, because we were well planned by using the data we had from the previous 12 months in both instances, we were in a really good position to have that bedrock in place to then effectively use that as a springboard to then be embellishing all of the reactive content once both of those incidences had actually happened on those nights, to then really see a snowball situation of how we could then do line after line around what was happening. And I think that then, coupled with that, using the real-time data to work out what our focuses were exactly, because we could see where people were going to and pivoting towards in real time, meant that the way we reacted became a lot easier, where it could have seemed as though it was almost an infinite opportunity with what to do around both of those events. Actually, if you're then being guided by the real-time data, you are then basically enabling yourself to have the success very, very quickly, and also succeed in sustaining that for days to come, where you're then gaining the authority around those particular search terms as well that the data is showing up.
How about you, Evan, in terms of search terms, in terms of sources? Do you, in moments like that, do you optimize for particular sources, particular platforms? How does that work?
Yeah, I think you want to, using things like Google Trends as well as things like Newsroom, you kind of see where the interest is, what's spiking, and kind of making sure you're capitalizing, as Philippa said. So I think that's kind of really key area, yeah.
And how about you, Alex? Have you got an example of...
Yeah, I certainly do. I guess the example that comes to mind is when Queen Elizabeth II died in September last year. So, the context that's needed from a Time Out point of view is that we're not a hard news publisher. We do cover newsy stuff, but we're really about going out and eating and drinking and enjoying the best of the city. So when that came along, obviously everyone had to drop everything. I'm sure lots of people in this room found the same within their jobs too. It all became about focusing on this one big story and figuring out, using real-time analytics, what your place within that story would be. And for Time Out, we didn't know what it would be immediately, but what we began to find was that we were carving out a bit of a niche, because it wasn't just a huge global story and it wasn't just a national story. It was a very London story. So if you remember the queue, if you remember the procession, the funeral itself, even things like the way that the Queen's coffin came down from Scotland to London, these were all things that we found that we could cover in a way that other publishers, sure, they could, but we just happened to jump on those stories and become seen as an authority. So we were using Google Trends, but then we were reacting to the stuff that really stuck. So we were dropping the things that publishers like The Independent were obviously way bigger and quicker than us on, but we were picking up on the event stuff. So we reported on the eventy things, but also the experience. We went down to the queue and interviewed people. We did Vox Pops, things like that. And then we also covered the kind of the legacy that the Queen had on London itself. Again, keeping that focus quite tight to what Time Out's USP is and specialism. And what we actually found in the end, we were very delighted that I think we were named by the Press Gazette as the third fastest rising news publisher for the UK audiences in September, which we didn't expect, because we're a kind of small but mighty team. And again, that was just purely using real-time analytics to go with what was working, to ignore what wasn't working, and to be reactive and to go deeper and deeper and deeper once you find out that people are interested in the stuff that you're putting out.
I've got an example actually of something where, you've got a real pain point, something's going wrong, and that's where data can really be useful. So I've been working on running Black Friday for TI and Future for a number of years. So with Black Friday, you kind of prepare from like January the year before it kind of go on and on and on. You're creating loads of evergreen pieces and things like that. But really, it's all about the day. What's happening on the day, the kind of few days before that, that's when all the audience is driving revenue. And we often found that suddenly the things that we would expecting to perform, the things that that were doing well up to a week before, suddenly weren't. And really kind of looking at the real time, looking at who's performing well, looking at the competition, kind of going, okay, what do we need to do, can really make a difference. So looking at what's doing well in top stories, in Google News, seeing what we can take from that, looking at trends again, and kind of making sure we're capitalizing on that, meant that we turned what was kind of turning into a bit of a disaster into a success in the end.
Okay, well, let's change track slightly and talk about AI, which seems to be a bit of a common theme at this conference. So, as I say at Taboola, we're using AI to personalize homepages, and that means basically, display the right kind of content, the most interesting content, the most relevant content to each individual user as they come into the site, all under full editorial control. Bit of an open-ended question, but what do you think of AI, this new editorial assistant that's just sort of arrived in your own newsroom, and how do you think it can help or indeed hinder your operations going forward?
I'll go first. So I think, like you've hinted at, Nigel, it's in a sense a real problem. I think there's a lot of appeal that goes alongside any thoughts of it, because clearly it can offer an additional pair of hands, several pairs of hands, depending on how you want to apply it. And that's really attractive. But actually, on the other side, of course, there are so many danger areas that you can easily fall into if it's not treated correctly. At the moment, who knows what that will look like in even a few months' time, but certainly in a few years' time, it will no doubt have progressed much further than it has at this early stage that we're seeing it in at the moment. So I think for us at the moment, it's something that is very interesting to us. We're really keen to explore constantly how we can use it, but with that in mind, knowing that we want to remain safe. We want to be very clear as well that, you have to present it in a certain way. You've got to be authentic, I think, and I think that's something that will always play into it, whether you're using it to collate content, and therefore journalists are simply formulating their ideas using with what AI brings up for them, or whether it's something that becomes more intrinsic in how the whole dynamic of the newsroom works in the future. I think that's yet to be seen. I think it's still far too early at this point, certainly for us, to feel comfortable to go down that route. But I certainly think that in terms of using it even as simply as a information aggregator, that's a really interesting area that can, apart from anything else, create efficiency, which is of course always really attractive, and can actually then not be too dangerous, because you're always going to have a human looking over whatever it is that content is, whatever it's collated for you. So I think that is really the kind of the very brief overview of my thoughts on it at this point.
I completely agree. I think there are clearly a lot of kind of considerations and dangers, but I would say that I'm overwhelmingly kind of excited about all the opportunities. And funnily enough, coming to something like this and hearing the conversations around it, I feel like this has all exploded within the past 3 or 4 months. AI has been around for a very, very long time. We've all been using it in kind of hidden ways behind the scenes. But with ChatGPT, it's suddenly shown us all how it can manifest itself in a very accessible and kind of user-facing way. But even within that time, I've seen the conversations go from being quite fearful around the impact it's going to have on industries like ours. But now I feel like people they're starting to wrap their heads around it. And to your point about, giving it the human touch, that's definitely what I'm hearing. I'm hearing experts, and I'm certainly not an expert on AI in particular, but listening to experts, they're certainly warning of, don't go and use these tools just to churn out tons and tons of content that doesn't actually get checked over. Everyone's kind of advocating for its use as a crutch and as a support to editors to do their jobs better. And I guess the context that I see it with, and I'm sure we can all relate, anyone who does work within publishing, that ours is a field that is constantly changing, and we all go through a lot of tightening, and we're used to team sizes shrinking, budget shrinking, and that's certainly been a narrative that I've been familiar with over the years, and I see that AI is the potential way out of that. So certainly at Time Out, we've built such a huge footprint when it comes to our content. A lot of content is out there for us to keep up to date, for us to stay on top of, and it's a struggle. We do struggle to do that, and we don't want out-of-date stuff. We don't want inaccurate stuff, with the Time Out brand on it. And I see potential for AI to step in at these moments to make editors more efficient, or at least more able to focus on the stuff that they do really, really well. And I think there are a million different uses for it. You've gone through some really, really good ones there, Philippa. So yeah, I'm excited about it. I think it's gonna, we've got to embrace it.
I think it's not just about content creation as well. I think it's about thinking about how it can help you with shortcuts. So things that I love using it for. So whenever I get stuck in my head, I'm like, okay, how do I plan for this? You can kind of just write some very basic things like, can you give me a headline for a news story, or can you give me a commissioning document for a freelancer or something like that? And it can really help kind of draft that. But again, absolutely needs that human element to kind of go over that, make sure it's correct, make sure everything's right. But that could be a really nice shortcut. Other uses, I'm working with a client looking at using it to moderate forum comments. Again, there's a lot of spam, there's a lot of things that have kind of made that user-generated content really not that useful anymore. So if AI can go in there and kind of start weeding out the spam and weeding out the kind of negative sentiment, all that sort of stuff, it can start providing, start thinking as publishers about starting incorporating that a little bit more again as well.
I think it's kind of got a role as like Mr. Muscle, doing the jobs that everyone else hates.
And if ChatGPT becomes more of a destination for users to discover content, how do you fight back in that regard? How do you ensure that your users come to your site and you retain that loyalty? Could that be an issue?
Yeah, I mean, sorry if I jump in here. I've seen this already. I've been playing around with Bing. Obviously, Bing has now incorporated ChatGPT. Now, when you ask for something using that, it is providing the answer with a very tiny little number reference to kind of click to bring you to your site. That has a lot of potential to drop your audience. So how do you fight against that? I think there's brand is, kind of build your brand, build your personality. Video, I think, is another way to really think about, okay, what can't AI do at the moment? So I think those are certain things that I think, you can do to fight back.
I'd just to add to that, I'd be lying if I said that we weren't talking about it a lot within Time Out, and certainly worried about it. We know that Google's about to roll out its own AI search function, and we assume that will have a knock-on impact on the amount of referral traffic we get through search. So we talk about it a lot, and I don't necessarily have a solution, but I do have a hope that users will still come to trusted sources, and it will simply become another tool in their arsenal. Similar to how featured snippets were rolled out, and we all feared that would stop referral traffic coming to websites, and that didn't quite happen. So I think it'll be interesting actually to see how, obviously as publishers, we need to react and build brand and build other routes to our content. But I'm really interested to see how users adopt AI, and I think learning how to prompt is going to be a big thing as well, in the same way that we've all inadvertently learned how to Google things. We just write phrases that we know will return the search results that we want. It's going to be the same with AI, and it'll just be interesting to see what people do use it for and trust it for, and what they still come to publishers for.
Yeah, and I think that what's really encouraging actually in terms of some of the developments over the past few months with AI, but also with the likes of Google and their most recent core updates, actually really putting the emphasis back onto authenticity, back onto brand, back onto having a particular name against something. I think that hopefully that will only continue, and it's the whole idea of trust, isn't it, that you can't escape. Luckily, the user in whatever capacity needs, quite rightly, that trust to actually engage with that piece of content, believe it, want to return, and that whole idea of longevity and the core engagement that creates, I think can still at this point in time only actually be generated properly and thoroughly if it's a name that people recognize and they've got that trust in. And interestingly, more recently, our travel correspondent Simon Calder, who I know some of you will probably be well aware of, he did a test actually to test out whether he could be beaten by an AI, very playful, funny piece that you should definitely have a read of if you haven't already, but basically put himself to the test, and luckily it was a really interesting one that proved at this point anyway, that human element, like we were saying, is really the thing that makes the difference still. So I think that is a really encouraging thing to hold on to, that is creating that really nice balance at the moment that means you've got to have a bit of both.
Yeah. Interestingly, Washington Post, I think they've just done a similar thing with an itinerary for DC, and it was a similar conclusion where the AI tool did produce a really nice itinerary, but it still needed, it was only a beginning, the writer envisaged users using that as a jumping off point, just as one in an arsenal of kind of things that they can engage with to plan their trip. So hopefully they'll still come to brands like The Independent and Time Out, and as well as getting a guidebook, and it's just yet another thing that they can use to inform and educate about where they might be traveling or what they might be doing.
I was talking to a German publisher recently, and they were just launching a news quiz, a daily news quiz, and they were going to use ChatGPT to generate those questions on a daily basis. They'd obviously check them, but just to give them those ideas for this quiz, and I think BuzzFeed have done something similar as well. But very lastly, Philippa, we've been working with you on personalisation and AI. Just your thoughts on that in terms of, is that a good use of AI in terms of exposing more journalism to more of your readers? How do you feel about that?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting because one of the elements of that is, of course, the ability to showcase content to a group of users that's specific to them. So what that looks like then is the content that's being shown at any one time can be relevant to how engaged that particular user group is, which obviously from the point of view of a human, it's very difficult to do. And I think that what's great is that whatever you do as a human homepage editor, as an example, the subjectivity is always going to be there to an extent, however much you try and remove yourself. So actually using the AI element in each of those instances, I think forces some content to be showcased in a way that it never would be before, and quite rightly should in a lot of instances. And it doesn't mean that those decisions being taken by the AI is always right in terms of what the most important content is to showcase. But I think that it certainly gives a different view that's always really, really important. And that probably is much like what you would have experienced for decades in terms of those newsroom discussions, where you have differing people coming in and having different thoughts on a particular event, for instance, and how that should be covered, what elements are the most important. And actually, if you've then got an additional arm to all of that coming in, because you've got an AI determining what is the most important based on your audience, that's really, really interesting and useful at the same time, because actually it makes you think. It makes you, even if it's not being presented automatically, it at least gives you that idea to treat content in a different way, not only from the point of view of the point of concept, but all the way through to then how you might be actually showcasing that on a homepage, which is then obviously what that AI element from Taboola is so interestingly bringing to the fore. That means that, apart from anything else as well, plays into that whole idea of efficiency. You know, if you don't have to have so much of a homepage curated, actually that person that had been doing that entirely is then freed up to be working on other things that actually are going to offer the audience something that they are after much more, because actually they are thirsty for the content rather than actually how well curated in a subjective way the homepage is. I don't know whether
Absolutely.
you guys have more to say.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Well, I'm going to throw it open to the floor now. Has anyone got any questions? There's a question at the back there. Excellent. I think there's a microphone on its way. Thank you, panel.
From Alex, it's all about from a consumer perspective, but also from a historical perspective. Because I remember when Time Out was a physical magazine, and if I wanted to see gigs, I'd go and see what was on what day. But now, if I go onto the home, if I go to find out I've got guest gigs, but I can't see. I don't know what I can see. I can't see all the gigs that are on and make up my own mind. So I was just wondering, is there possibility that what we're talking about could address this in the future and allow someone like me, or maybe I'm not the target audience, so it may be that your business strategy isn't really to do with me, it's maybe to do with visitors from abroad, I don't know, but is there any chance that there may be the possibility that I could sort of navigate in order to find that?
No, I think that's a great question, and you're right. Time Out's gone from listing a lot of things before the internet came along. It was that was the role it performed. Then, as the internet came along, we continued listing things, but it takes an awful lot of legwork and kind of churn to do that for what is very ephemeral content. And then, of course, when Google comes along and makes a lot of that discoverable just directly through Google, that's where those have fallen away. But I think you're completely right. AI could very much fill in that space. I guess there's challenges there around kind of vetting that level of content. And another of the conversations we often have is, why would people come to us rather than going to Google if the information is that freely available?
There's no central point, I don't think.
That's true.
I mean, I always, because I'm older, I remember like years back, Time Out used to be the central point where you'd go and find that information. I think there's I don't really know where else to look if I wanted to just get everything was on and kind of decide for myself what I was going to see.
Yeah, no, it's a really good point. I think you're totally right to see that potential. So it's certainly something we'll look at for sure.
Thank you.
Thank you for the question. Yes, another question. We've got a microphone. Someone pass the microphone.
To pick up on the gentleman just now, my challenge is always to do with cookie, first party and third party, right? And this one is great for personalization, but we also got a great wall called cookie. How do we solve that thing then?
You mean with third-party data?
Personalization, right? But then again, right, we live in this era of GDPR and cookie constraints. So how do we actually reconcile that?
I think that's a great question. I don't know if I'm best placed to, to speculate.
Yeah, that's a tricky one, because if you don't have the data, how do you then personalize? How do you know if you don't know what the person likes and what they've seen, how do you personalize? I think logins, trying to get people to subscribe and have a subscription model where you can then gather first-party data, I think that is going to be a really valuable way. So trying to get people to log in is going to be a really good way of being able to personalize and do that, I think.
Yeah, and I think even in this last year, 6 months, there's been so many changes, altered how we go about that, particularly in terms of how we acquire that data, because of the additional restrictions that have been enforced. And I think it's something that has to be constantly reviewed to try and create that balance of the reason why anyone is going to give their data in the first instance, and the value exchange that exists there. Because of course it's got to work together, hasn't it? Like you say, if that data and that information isn't given in the first place, actually you are only ever going to get so much information about your audience, which, as we've all been saying, is so important to actually then provide an offering that is wanted and needed by the audience that are coming to that particular publisher day in, day out.
I think the other thing you might have.
Oh, go on. Sorry.
I was just thinking about intent, right? So if you know about the intent of the user and you start thinking about, okay, if they've come in from a certain keyword to a certain landing page, then you can use AI to maybe structure that journey after that, depending on what you want them to do. Sign up, buy something, read more, whatever that is. So there's potential there as well.
At Taboola, in terms of the personalization, we don't just, we can personalize for anonymous users as well, because we're using a lot of contextual signal as well. So the time of day, the browser they use, the type of content itself, the headline, the context of the story, and also we're looking at what other users are using around the open web as well. So we have lots of signals coming in. So even if the user doesn't, provide consent, we can still personalize that experience to that user. Any other questions? All good. Excellent. Well, it's just to say two things, really. Firstly, many thanks to this fantastic panel today. Thank you very much for your time. Really interesting. I've got three things to say, actually. The second thing, thank you very much for attending. I really appreciate you listening to this show. And the third one is that we're having a few drinks at the Taboola booth after this. So if you want to continue the conversation with the experts, we're just near the kind of entrance, near the cafe area. You're all welcome. And Dario's paying. So see you then. Thank you very much. Cheers.